So welcome everybody. I just opened the webinar doors and I can see people pouring into the room. We've got well over 100 people already. And I can see people already active in the chat box. Javeria Rana, hello to Pakistan. You are first in the chat box today. Okay, well done. Kata, you are second. Good morning. Hello in Vietnam. Hello, Camille. Okay, got lots of people saying hello. Now, I've noticed here that most of you are sending your messages just to hosts and panelists. Please make sure that you change your chat settings. So just above where you type, if you click that blue box, you should have a setting that says everyone. So please change to everyone so we can all see. Oh, so many messages coming in. And I can see people from all over the world: Romania, Tokyo, Morocco, Romania, Indonesia, Italy, Russia, Malta, India, Turkey, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Turkey. Wow, Saudi Arabia, Singapore. That's where I am. Hello in Japan. So people from all over the world. Absolutely fantastic to see. All right. My clock says 1 minute to 5, and I'm just going to get going in just a second. Say a warm welcome to everyone. Thanks for attending. All right. Okay. 5 o'clock. So I'm going to get going. We're already recording, so that's great. So you will get a copy of this afterwards. So let me begin. So hello, welcome to today's webinar, which is how to teach pronunciation and global communication, and it's presented by educator and author Marek Kigskowiak. I'm very happy to be hosting the session today. My name is Will Lachette, and I am a senior academic consultant for National Geographic Learning. I'm really excited about this webinar with Marek because I've been using a lot of his materials recently, and I'm sure that this is going to be a really interesting and useful session. So before we get started, I'd like to just take a minute to go over a few housekeeping notes. So first of all, at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that there are several icons. The first button on the left is the chat function. So as I mentioned just now, please be sure that you're sending your message to everyone so that everyone can read your message. And you can use that chat box to interact with Marek during the webinar, and please keep your chat on topic. On the right, you'll see a Q&A button. So please use this to ask questions, and we will have a bit of time at the end of the session where I will ask Marek your questions, which you put in that Q&A box. Finally, we'll be sending along a certificate of attendance and a recording of the session within 5 business days of the webinar. Okay, so wait for that. Okay, within 5 working days, you will have your certificate and the recording of this webinar. So let me introduce today's speaker. So we have got Marek Kigskowiak, and he has been in ELT for over 10 years. He has a PhD in TESOL and has published extensively in peer-reviewed journals on native speakerism and teaching English as a lingua franca. He has taught English in 7 different countries in a variety of educational contexts and currently writes materials for National Geographic Learning. He also runs his own company called Academic English Now, where he helps PhD students write excellent theses and research papers for high impact journals. So a very warm welcome to you, Marek, and it's over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Will, and welcome everybody. It's really great to see so many people from so many different countries. So let's get started. And, you know, I really wanted to start with a short activity. And I've got a couple of questions for you in here that I'd like you to discuss, not in person, but just in the chat box. If you can just look at the question, and I'll give you, you know, 1 minute to 2 minutes. And if you can put the answers to those questions in the chat box, that would be amazing. And don't worry, you know, if you don't know exactly, but just like make an educated guess and put the answers in the chat box. Will says 1 billion people speak English overall. Luminita, more than 1 billion. Right, and what about the second question? Which accents do you typically hear in class in listening activities? And what about when you know, go out of the classroom and use English outside of the classroom? So a lot of people say American accents, British and American. What about outside of the class? Some people say all sorts of accents outside of the classroom. All right, and what about the third question? Do you agree or disagree that there's only one correct accent? All right, awesome. So lots of good answers here, and you know, really, I'll provide you with the answers to those questions throughout the webinar. So I'm not going to answer them just now, but we'll be discussing all these issues throughout the whole webinar. And as well said, you know, feel free to put any questions in the Q&A box, and I'll answer them afterwards. And you know, you can of course comment in the chat as well. Right. So depending how, you know, who you ask, which researcher you ask, approximately 80% of people who use English worldwide use it as a second or third or fourth language, right? So approximately 80% of people who use English are non-native speakers, right? Of course, this figure can vary from like 70%, something like this, but usually, you know, we can safely assume that there's, you know, about 80% of people who use English that are non-native speakers. So only about 20% speak English as the first language, right? Yet when we teach pronunciation, standard native speaker models predominate in the classroom, in published materials, right? And I emphasize standard here because it's not just any native speaker model that predominates when we teach pronunciation, but is the, you know, standard British pronunciation or the received pronunciation and general American pronunciation, right? So not any native speaker accent is welcome when we teach pronunciation. In fact, when C analyzed business English course books, 5 very common, very popular business English course books used worldwide, the researcher found that only 16% of all the accents in those books were non-native speakers, right? So 84% of all the accents in the books were native speakers, right? And mostly standard British or American accents. And this is in business materials, right? And you'd think that, you know, in the business world, most of the communication really, you know, goes on between people from all sorts of different countries, right? Now, also Tomlinson and Masuhara point out that, you know, these non-native speakers who are present, you know, there's few of them, but if they are present in published materials, they usually tend to speak and write with the same educated English middle-class native speaker voices, right? And in fact, when C further analyzed that, you know, those 16% of non-native speaker voices in those business published materials, he found that only 0.5%, so less than 1% of all the voices in those business books that the researcher analyzed had a distinguishable foreign accent. everybody else spoke with a standard British or American accent, right? This is quite shocking because I don't know about you, but when I go out of the classroom, mostly what I hear is some sort of non-standard, non-native speaker accent. That's usually the English I hear when I go outside of the classroom and hang around with people, right? Yet in some published materials, we see 0.5% of that, right? So now, instead, we should probably be focusing on pronunciation that is important. Now, which sounds are important? That's the real question here, right? If we're not just going to focus on a standard British or a standard American accent to teach pronunciation, what are we going to focus on? Well, I'm gonna show you some pronunciation features, and what I'd like you to do in the chat box is to decide which of them you think are important for clear pronunciation, which of them are unimportant, and which of them are unhelpful. And in here, I mean important or unimportant for clear pronunciation that is easy to understand in international context, right? So very quickly, maybe if you can do that in the chat box, right? You don't have to classify all these sounds, but you can just give us some ideas that you have, which you think would be important, and which maybe is unhelpful. So Sheng says vowels, and are vowels important or unimportant, Sheng? All right, so Claudia says long and short vowels are important. Somebody says all of them are important. Kitty says consonants are important, right? All right, so let's come back to what we were discussing, right? So I'll give you the answers to which sounds are important, unimportant in just a second. But what happens very often is that a foreign accent is also seen as a sign of low proficiency, right? And pronunciation practice in most books focuses on intonation, word stress, and features of connected speech. If you don't believe me, then I'd encourage you to open any published materials really that you use for teaching pronunciation, and you'll see that most of it is intonation, word stress, and features of connected speech. In fact, when I analyzed general English adults books from major publishers, it turned out that in just one of the levels, at the beginning level, 48% of all pronunciation practice focused on features of connected speech, right? So half of all the pronunciation slots in that book were just connected speech. Yet, as numerous researchers point out, connected speech is likely to make you less intelligible, not more intelligible. And I mean, this makes perfect sense, because connected speech is often the reason why we have to help our students understand fast speech, right? Because when people connect a lot of things, right, it's more difficult to understand. So it's kind of mind-boggling that then we would spend 50% of our pronunciation teaching time focusing on something that actually makes people less intelligible, right? And this also means that pronunciation features that are important for intelligibility are actually very rarely practiced. In fact, again, in that same research where I analyzed general English course books for adults, it turned out that just between 5 and 33% of all pronunciation slots in all those books were focusing on pronunciation features that research actually shows are important for intelligibility. So think about that. Let that sink in for a moment. It turns out that between 77 and 95% of all pronunciation practice in those materials that I analyzed we're focusing on pronunciation features that aren't actually that important, right? So now you might be wondering then, okay, can you tell me which pronunciation features are important and which are unimportant or unhelpful? Well, I'll tell you now. And just before I do that, you might first be wondering, how do you know, or how do you determine which features are important, which are unimportant? Well, this list is based on research. And basically what researchers do is that they record conversations in international contexts where people from all sorts of different linguistics backgrounds communicate in English, right? And then they look for, then they identify instances of misunderstanding, and then they identify whether that misunderstanding had to do with pronunciation. If it had to do with pronunciation, which pronunciation feature likely caused this misunderstanding? Because if this pronunciation feature caused misunderstanding, then it's probably important for intelligibility, right? And if you do that enough over hundreds, thousands of hours of recordings in different geographical contexts, you start to see patterns, right? And you start to get evidence for which pronunciation features are important and which are less important, right? So let's take a look at them. Starting with the important ones, long and short vowels are very important, right? So the difference between pick and peak, right? The vowel as in peril is also important. Consonants, apart from the TH sound, all the other consonants are very important for intelligibility. So like the difference between vet and bet. Aspiration of initial voiceless plosives is very important as well. You can very easily identify aspiration if you just put your hand in front of your mouth and you say the word pet, as in the animal that you have at home, right? Pet. And then you will hear a burst of air on your palm, on your hand, and that's aspiration, right? And this is important as well for intelligibility. Consonant clusters, especially those at the beginning and in the middle of words like screen, obstacle, they're very important for intelligibility. It's important that all the consonants in the cluster are pronounced. And then nuclear stress. This shouldn't be confused with like sentence stress, which is very often practiced in the classroom. Nuclear stress refers to the most prominent word or syllable that is stressed in a given utterance. So not all the stressed syllables, but the most prominent stress, right? So compare, for example, I didn't buy the car, I rented it, with I didn't buy the car, but he did, right? So this nuclear stress changes the meaning of the utterance. And finally, adapting your pronunciation. By that, I mean, being able to change how you speak to either correct your mistakes or, be flexible with your pronunciation and say things in ways that are clearer to the listener, right? That has been found to be a crucial thing in intelligibility, right? So these are important sounds. What about the unimportant or unhelpful? Vowel quality has been found to be much less important than most people think. So the difference between the vowel in run and run is actually not that important for intelligibility. Word stress, so whether you say comfortable or comfortable, usually doesn't cause problems, right? And please note that, in here we are talking about, what usually happens. Of course, you can always find an exception where somebody said something, and in that particular case, this led to a misunderstanding, right? You can find exceptions for anything, but we're talking about like patterns from from all the research that we've got, right? Sentence stress, not really important at all, even though it's practiced extensively. Intonation also hasn't been found to have much of an impact on intelligibility. Weak forms and other features of connected speech are actually unhelpful, right? To intelligibility as well, right? And I'll give you all the references later so you can look them up if you're, if you're sort of academically inclined and you'd like to read up on them. But this is basically kind of the state of the art that we've got at the moment. Now, what does this mean for teaching pronunciation, you might be asking? Well, I think the first thing that we want to do is to focus on clear pronunciation, not native-like pronunciation, but clear pronunciation. And by clear pronunciation, I mean, the features that are important for intelligibility. That's what we want to be focusing on. And this is no different to teaching, let's say, vocabulary. Surely when you teach vocabulary, you want to focus on the vocabulary that is important for your learners, right? If you have a learner who wants to give business presentation, you are going to focus on a different vocabulary than a learner who's writing a research paper, right? That's just, it's common sense, right? And the same thing applies to pronunciation. We want to focus on the things, our time in the classroom is limited, so let's focus on the things that have the greatest impact on our learners' pronunciation, right? And I think it's also very important to promote variety and non-native speakers as models. We shouldn't give learners this false impression that they must speak like that, that voice on the tape or on the CD in order to be intelligible. They don't have to at all, It's not about having a foreign accent or not having a foreign accent, but it's about, clear pronunciation. And I think it's also important to distinguish between productive and receptive pronunciation. So by productive, I mean the sounds that they need to be able to produce, and receptive, being able to understand things, right? And then also some general principles, explain how the sounds are made when you teach pronunciation or prepare materials, draw students' attention to the important sounds, and increase difficulty. And I'm going to show you all these principles with different activities, right? So that they become clearer and clearer. So now we mentioned that consonants are crucial for intelligibility in international contexts, right? And here's a simple activity. This is from an elementary course books. And so, it's very simple. It's just the difference between b and v, right? So this is for low levels, right? And what we want to do here is use second language users as models as well, right? And this isn't done enough, in my opinion. Like, when you listen to all the voices on the recordings for pronunciation, it's usually this, received pronunciation voice, or this standard American voice that models the sounds. But none of our students will ever be able to speak like that. I mean, it's an unattainable goal. And to be frank, very few native speakers actually speak like that voice on the CD, right? So that's why I think it's good to, to present our students with more attainable, more relatable, more relevant models that are closer to how our students will be using English, right? So let's take a look here and let's see how this is done.
B, berry, best, ban, v, very, vest, van.
Right. So, we can clearly hear that person is not a native speaker, but does that matter? Well, not really. I mean, they're pronouncing the target sounds correctly. And, I would argue that this person makes a much more relatable and relevant model for our students. I mean, our students on elementary level can actually aim to speak like that person, right? They'll never be able to speak like, with received pronunciation, at least not on elementary level. And research shows that probably, 99.9% of adult learners will never be able to speak, imitate completely a native speaker voice, right? So I think this is more motivating as well, because our students can actually achieve that and they can see themselves speaking like that, right? So that's one of our important principles. Use second language users as models for your students. And also explain how the sound is made, right? Look what we do here in the box, right? I'm sure you do this as a teacher as well, but if you're writing materials, hopefully your students will be looking at those materials later on at home, right? So we want to tell them how to make the sound actually as well and show it to them, because they might not be aware of what actually the difference between these two sounds is when it comes to making them. Now, another important feature of pronunciation was aspiration. And as I said, it's very easy to explain to students, and you can try it right now. Just put your hand in front of your mouth and try to say words like to. You should feel a burst of air on your hand, right? That's aspiration, to. And then when you say do, you shouldn't feel a burst of air with the initial consonant, right? And of course, this is for an elementary level, so it's made very, very simple. But then we want to make progression across levels as well, right? And strangely, this never happens with pronunciation when you look at what happens in across levels. The only thing that happens with pronunciation is that we have exactly the same pronunciation features practiced with more difficult vocabulary, right? But surely this is not the way to do it. I mean, if you're teaching, let's say, grammar, then you're going to teach less difficult stuff on elementary level and more difficult stuff on upper intermediate level, right? That's kind of common sense. So we want to do the same stuff with pronunciation. We want to teach easy stuff on elementary level, but important stuff, but stuff that is easy, appropriate for the level. And then as we move up in the levels, we want to teach more difficult stuff, not more difficult language, but more difficult pronunciation, right? For example, we come back to aspiration on upper intermediate, right? And you can see how much more complex this is. We add a lot of nuance in here, that aspiration only occurs with sounds p, k, t in stressed syllables, right? When they are followed by a vowel, not all stressed syllables, right? So this is way more difficult than what we presented at elementary level. Of course, there were also steps in between, but you get the idea, right? That we want to have progression across levels in here. Another important feature that we want to practice is consonant clusters, right? And again, you can see how we draw students' attention to what is actually important, right? Because sometimes, students will try to pronounce something and they're not able to get it exactly right, but they're not even maybe 100% sure what they should be doing, like what is actually important, right? So they need to know that it's important to pronounce every consonant sound, right? That's their goal. They shouldn't omit any consonant sounds, right? But sometimes it's okay to insert a vowel, right? Especially at this level, at pre-intermediate, at, let's say, upper intermediate, we would definitely expect students to be pronouncing all the consonants in that cluster correctly. But at a lower level, we can tell them that it's okay to insert vowel. Why is it okay? Because, research shows that it doesn't really decrease intelligibility that much. What really impacts intelligibility is when people delete consonants from that clusters. That has a huge impact on understanding, right? So I think it's important to draw our students' attention to it so that they can do more meaningful practice in the classroom and actually know what to focus on. Right? And you can do all sorts of, different games with it and things. Here's an example of a game where they, with geography and lots of ST clusters, right? Longest river, largest country in the world, right? Which city has the largest population, right? And maybe we can try to do it right now. What's the longest river in the world, actually? Is it the Nile, the Congo, or the Mississippi? What do you all think? The Nile. All right, that was easy. Now, which is the largest country in the world? The US, Russia, or Canada? Russia. That was easy. That's too easy for you. Which city has the largest population? Beijing, Singapore, or Tokyo? Beijing. Tokyo. And here we are kind of divided between Beijing and Tokyo. I would have to look it up. Maybe Will could Google it while I'm showing you the other activities. I think it's Tokyo, but maybe I know the Chinese population has grown immensely, you know, in the past decade. So maybe Beijing is getting close, but I think Tokyo has over 30 million people. So I'd say Tokyo. All right. So that's consonant clusters. And also another thing we want to emphasize in the classroom is long and short vowels. So not so much the difference in the quality of the vowel, but the difference in length, right? The difference in length between something like food and wood, which has short vowel, right? It has a different quality to it, but that quality is somewhat less important. What's really important is that length, right? So when you're teaching those sounds, you know, you need to emphasize to students that they need to make those vowels appropriately long. And here's a game that we can play with it. So your task is to go from people on the left of the board to the right, only stepping on words with a long vowel, right? See if you can do that. And you can, by the way, kind of like step diagonally down and things like that, right? And if you can, well, you can start with other ones as well. I saw Will started with keyboard, but you can also start with people. That's fine. All right, so if you start with people, what do we need after people? Which word has a long vowel? We could do student, right? Student has a long vowel. And then after student, we could do smooth, I think, right? And then we could do corner. And then we could do awesome or awesome, or depending kind of what kind of vowel you're going to put there. And then we're going to do eagle, for example. And then we could do floor. But after floor, what would we do after floor? I think we kind of stuck after floor, right? We can't do spirit, we can't do brush. We can do underarm, right? And then we could do steam, right? Of course, there's more than one option, but that's a game you can play with a student. Obviously, this is designed more for higher levels, right? Because in here we're practicing all long vowels. You could make it more simple and just have one long and one short vowel, right? And to make it simpler at lower levels, right? Now, another thing that that we want to focus on is nuclear stress. So you might remember that nuclear stress is the most prominent stress in any given short utterance. So it's not all the stressed syllables, it's the most prominent stressed syllables, right? So what we're going to do is I'm going to read the sentence, right? Depending on the question, right? So, the sentence is, Sylvie asked me to buy flowers. Now, if you ask me, who asked you to buy flowers? I will say, Sylvie asked me to buy flowers. What did Sylvie do? Sylvie asked me to buy flowers. What did Sylvie ask you to do? Sylvie asked me to buy flowers. What did Sylvie ask you to buy? Sylvie asked me to buy flowers. You see how it changes from like Sylvie asked me to buy, Sylvie asked me to buy flowers, right? That's the nuclear stress. And that's really what impacts intelligibility a lot in international context. Not kind of so much word stress or sentence stress, but this nuclear stress, this most prominent stress, because it changes the meaning of the utterance a lot. Right? And, another principle that I mentioned earlier was to promote variety. And by that, I mean, a variety of different accents, be it native or non-native speaker accents. Because, I think, first of all, when it comes to listening skills, we would be doing our students a disservice if, most of the things they heard in our classroom were standard British and standard American accents, because that's not what they're going to hear outside of the classroom. I mean, even if they live in Britain, they're not just going to hear standard British accent. In fact, they're probably going to hear little of it. And they're just going to hear all sorts of other accents that British people have, right? And I think in terms of, their own productive pronunciation, promoting variety is also important, because sometimes there is more than one correct way of saying things. And, we don't necessarily have to make our students pronounce it, like a standard British accent might pronounce it, right? There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. And here's one activity, right? From an upper intermediate level, when we talk about the sound th, right? So, in standard British and American English, th is pronounced, between your teeth, right? As th, right? Or the. But I don't know if most, that's maybe not true, but a lot of people in the world, including native speakers, don't pronounce it like that. They, for example, people say th and v. If you go to London, one feature of an accent from there is to say think and the, right? If you go to Ireland, a lot of people will say think, I think, and that, right? And many people in the States also say that, right? And this change, research shows, has no impact on pronunciation. So why on earth would we really make our students say th, right? This can be, really horrible. I remember myself in university when we had pronunciation classes. I spent a year in front of a mirror trying to say th, only to find out 10 years later that it doesn't matter. And it wasn't a nice feeling, I promise you, I'd rather focus my attention on stuff that actually matters. So let's do this activity. So I'm going to play the recording for you. Listen to the pronunciation, right? And, identify how each speaker pronounces the words think and the, right? And then which pronunciation do you prefer? And let us know in the chat box. Great. Let me just move this thing.
1. Think, think, think. The.
2. Think, think, think. Da. 3.
Think, think, think. Va.
All right. So, obviously the first person pronounced it in the standard way. The second person pronounced it as t and d, right? So think. And then the last person as f and v. So think, right? Well, which of these pronunciation do you prefer? A lot of people say 1. Some people say 3, 1 and 3. I like number 2 best. I really like think and that. I somehow I like that pronunciation, right? The point is that students have a choice, right? The standard pronunciation isn't better than the other pronunciations. It's the standard pronunciation because the people who speak like that, kind of are the source of the economic and political power in the English language, historically speaking. That's the only reason why it's considered standard. It's not standard because it's better or easier to understand. It has nothing to do with it, right? So I think we should give our students a choice. And if they choose to pronounce it as think or think, that's absolutely fine. The point is they shouldn't mix the pronunciation. So they shouldn't kind of switch and once say think and then say think. That could be confusing, right? But they could just choose one and go for it, right? Now, another important distinction to make is between productive and receptive pronunciation. What do I mean by that? Well, productive pronunciation is the pronunciation you need to say, produce, right? So those sounds that are important for intelligibility. And receptive pronunciation is the pronunciation that, you need to understand, right? So for example, we were saying that connected speech might actually make you less intelligible. So probably it doesn't make much sense to practice it a lot in the classroom, right? But of course, our students need to be able to understand that pronunciation, right? So here's an activity from, or a pronunciation box from pre-intermediate when we applied this principle, right? So we just want to make our students aware that, connected speech in this case, and assimilation specifically in this case, can make them less intelligible sometimes, because they need to know that. Because, if they say, what did you do? And the other person is just like totally confused, the student needs to know, or the English user needs to know how to change it and say, what did you do, to be more understandable, right? And you'd think, oh, that's common sense, everybody does it. No, nah, a lot of people don't do it. Like, what I've found is that, like, most people, especially people who have no training in languages and have never studied a language or learned a language, what they do is just they repeat exactly the same thing, but louder, right? That's usually what happens. So they'll just say it louder and louder, but so it's not that common sense, right? And I think it's important, especially on higher levels, to explain those things to our students and get them to practice it, right? And this is kind of related to adapting your pronunciation. Now, there's different ways in which you can adapt your pronunciation. One important way is to be able to correct your mistakes, right? That's the first important way to adapt your pronunciation. Now, another important way to adapt your pronunciation is what I mentioned with connected speech. Let's say, as an example, connected speech, that you might say something without connected speech in order to be more understood, right? But what you might also do is to actually say things in a non-standard way in order to be understood. So I've listened to conversations that go something like this. So like last night we went out and we had some salmon for dinner. You had what for dinner? Well, we had salmon. You mean salmon? Yeah, salmon. Oh, salmon like the fish. Yeah, salmon, right? So initially the person says salmon, as the standard pronunciation would be, but the other person is confused, right? And then they kind of adapt, non-standard. You could view it as an incorrect way of pronouncing things as salmon, but they want to communicate, right? And sometimes you need to do that, whether we like it or not. The principal goal of language is to communicate, right? So these are some of the ways in which we can adapt our pronunciation. And here's an example of a pronunciation box from an advanced level, right? Where we, again, focused on like very fast speech, right? So as an example in here, a word like actually, right? When pronounced slowly, is pronounced as actually. But when we say it fast, it often sounds something like Ashley, right? Now, a good activity that you can try out with yourself right now, of course you can't write it, right? But you could try out, is to pronounce, these things quickly as you normally would, and most slowly, and think which pronunciation would be easier to understand, right? And this is something, that can be adapted to different levels, right? You can do exactly the same thing on elementary or beginner level, just with a specific pronunciation feature that you're looking at, right? So to sum up, how would we teach pronunciation for global communication? Well, first of all, I think this might be the most important principle, is to focus on clear pronunciation, not native-like pronunciation, but pronunciation that is easy to understand, full stop, right? How do we know if something is easy to understand? Well, we have quite a lot of research to indicate which sounds or features are more important than other sounds. So I think we should start with those. And then if we've covered them and we have more time, then we can move on to others, right? I think it's important to promote variety and non-native speakers as models, so that, you know, we have models that are more relatable, more natural, more motivating, you know, that our students can aspire to actually be. And I think we want to distinguish between productive and receptive pronunciation, right? Stuff that our students need to understand is not necessarily stuff that they need to produce or say. And overall, you know, explain the sound, how sounds are made, or show it to students, right? Draw students' attention to the important sounds and what they should actually do to be understood, and increase difficulty across levels, right? The pronunciation features that you practice at beginner level cannot be the same as the pronunciation features you practice at advanced, right? There's got to be some increase in difficulty. And that increase in difficulty doesn't mean more difficult vocabulary. It means actually more difficult pronunciation features, like we saw with aspiration. But the same thing can be done with consonants, where first, you know, you have just a single consonant, then you have consonant clusters with 2 consonants, then 3 consonants at the beginning of the word, in the middle, right? Across words. So you can increase the difficulty like that, right? And here are the references, right? I'd be happy to send you any of them, and you'll also get the slides, right? And that's it from me. So thanks a lot for attending and listening, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Hi, Marek. Thank you so much for that really interesting and thought-provoking session. I taught English in the classroom for 19 years, and I always felt that pronunciation was really overlooked and usually an afterthought. You know, it's not usually the main focus. And I think a lot of the points you made there are, you know, absolutely what we need in English teaching, and we need to think of it, you know, use these ideas and have a new approach.
On this, like, kind of pronunciation as an afterthought, there's an interesting phrase that I think it was Levis that used in his paper, that basically pronunciation is often seen just as a garnish, you know? So like when we plan courses, usually what happens is that, you know, we extensively plan the grammar and the vocabulary we're going to cover. And then what happens is that, like, we've got a grammar point or a vocabulary, and then we just kind of attach some sort of pronunciation that fits to it. But people don't give much thought to the overall pronunciation curriculum as they do to grammar curriculum or vocabulary curriculum, unfortunately.
I think that's absolutely right. And I also know that the program that you've been working on for National Geographic Learning Voices has taken a different approach and has actually included pronunciation right from the conception of the syllabus. So hopefully that's one program that has addressed that issue.
Yes, that's what we try to do. I mean, it was the same as kind of designing the reading, the listening, or the grammar syllabus, that we just sat down and, you know, we looked at which sounds are important. And then we started kind of mapping them out onto levels, right? As you would with grammar. That's exactly the same thing that we did. And then, you know, when you had that mapped out to levels, then you could start matching those features to whatever language was there as well to make it fit.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. So, Marek, there are a few questions in the Q&A box. You can open it and have a look. I'm going to ask you a couple of them. So one I thought was interesting here, and you kind of addressed it, but I think it's worth addressing again. It's an anonymous attendee has typed in, some people look down on non-native speakers because of our accents. And the question is, how do we get over that? How do we get past that?
Sorry, say that again. I lost focus for a
Yeah,
second. So I didn't.
some people look down on
Mm.
non-native speakers because of their accent. So there's a kind of bias against people who have non-native or non-standard accent. So how do we get past that? How can we give learners of English confidence that the way they speak, their accent is perfectly valid?
I think just by discussing it with them, doing different activities with them, you could, let's say, if you have, Spanish speaking students in the classroom, you could play them a recording of Salma Hayek, who sounds totally Mexican when she speaks English, yet she's perfectly understandable, right? And then just discuss that with students, and I wouldn't hide from it. I wouldn't impose any views on students, but just as you discuss some other controversial topics, you could discuss this and ask them, like, do you think that person is easy to understand? Why do you think they chose to sound like this? Do you think it would be better if she sounded American? Why? Why not? How do you sound? Why do you want to sound like that? Why do you think that's a good idea? Just asking them questions like that and getting them to discuss stuff, I think, can lead to insights from students. And then I think, the more variety you include in your classrooms, the more normal it's going to become for students, right? And I think most people kind of understand this idea that when they leave the classroom, they will hear all sorts of accents as well, because that's kind of what naturally happens.
Right. I agree. Absolutely. Okay. I've got another question here. Actually, this has come up a couple of times. So one from Alexandra, and she's asking about when we're teaching pronunciation to people who are taking international exams like IELTS. Well, Alexander said, should we pay less attention to pronunciation for exams? And the other question I had was, do the examiners take accent into account?
Yeah, so I used to be an IELTS examiner, and I think in theory, they don't judge you on your accent, right? So in theory, they judge how clear your pronunciation is, right? So I think if you're preparing students for an international exams, that's what you should focus on clear pronunciation. Now, having said that, I do remember very heated arguments where somebody did not want to give this particular student a 9 in pronunciation just because they sounded Indian, right? But they were perfectly understandable, like super understandable, and they had beautiful pronunciation, like explaining, with nuances to the meaning. But, some people were adamant that she could not get a 9 because she sounded Indian, right? So I think, yeah, I think, that there's still some way to go, but in theory and in general, I think a lot of examiners, maybe depending on the exam, they'll focus on clear pronunciation that's easy to understand.
Yeah, I mean, examiners are people, right? And people are different. So, whichever.
Yeah, we all have our biases, right? Right. Of course, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Let's just having a look in the. Can you see the Q&A?
I can. Yeah.
Anything you'd like to pick out?
Yeah, so like, for example, Anastasia is saying that why plosives are important, right? I don't know why they are important, but that's what research shows us time and time again. Like, so there's dozens and dozens of studies which clearly show that, pronouncing aspiration is important. Maybe because when you don't have the aspiration, pet is more likely to sound like bet, right? As in what you would do in a casino. That's probably the reason, right? And I know it sounds counterintuitive, but most studies also show that, vowel quality isn't important, but what's important is the vowel length, right? So of course the vowel in beach is long, right? And the vowel in that other word is not long. And that's usually kind of the thing that comes up as important. What will the English language be like in 100 years? Well, I don't know, to be honest. I have no idea what it will be in 100 years. Well, one thing that I can say for sure is that there will be less and less native speakers speaking English and more non-native speakers speaking English. That's for sure, right? Because populations in the West, in the US, the UK, Australia, that they're declining, right? And populations in, let's say, Asia are rising, and most of these people will be using English as a means of communication. I mean, unless something happens and English stops being the global language, which can happen, maybe we'll all be speaking Mandarin in 100 years. Who knows, right? That can happen.
English is definitely a language that has been changing quickly and will continue to change quickly. Even if you look in terms of the vocabulary that we use, the grammar rules are very flexible. So yeah, I think we can assume that English in 100 years will be quite different to how it is now. But yeah,
for sure.
Totally agree with you that we're going to see more and more second language learners speaking English, and fewer.
And I think, we all have like very strong opinions about what's correct, but if you actually look at what was correct 100 years ago, you would be very surprised. Like, for example, 100 years ago it was correct to say swimmed rather than swam. And lighted was also the correct form of the past participle of lit, right? We now say lit, but in the past people say lighted. So those things just change, because people start using a certain feature and then it becomes popular and then it just spreads around the world, right? So what Maureen is asking, what is my mother tongue? It's Polish.
Marek, there's one more question I would like to ask you here. Someone here is referring to you as your worship, which I'm not quite sure about, but they would like to know a bit more about productive and receptive pronunciation. So you mentioned those earlier. So what's the difference?
Yeah, so productive pronunciation is the pronunciation our students need to produce. So the way I see pronunciation, it would be, consonants, consonant clusters, those things that are important for pronunciation. This is the productive pronunciation we should be focusing on. And the receptive one is what they need to understand, right? So let's say for receptive pronunciation, you might focus on different features of connected speech, right? And help your students understand that when people speak clearly. So that would be the difference.
That's great. Thank you very much, Marek. Okay, right. We've still got a few minutes left, so maybe you can pick one more question and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, for sure. Would you recommend teaching the phonetic alphabet to help students understand English pronunciation better? I think it can help if you do it like if you start introducing it bit by bit. I think in my mind it would be quite helpful, but it's not necessary. I think they can just learn it through modeling, I think. How about kids who cannot choose or make any decisions which accent or pronunciation to use? We can't just let them choose. I don't know. We let children choose whether they want a strawberry ice cream or a vanilla ice cream. So I think we could let them choose. I don't see why. If you don't want to let them choose, I think, you can choose as a teacher what you think is most appropriate, following, certain principles that you believe are right. But I think children in a lot of situations are given choices, right? Of course, within certain constraints, right? But they are given choices.
Okay, right. Thank you very much, Marek. So yeah, thanks again for that fantastic session and for answering all of those questions. And thank you to everyone that has joined today and for participating. And before you leave, I just have a few things that I'd like to mention. A lot of you are asking about your certificate, and you will get a certificate. You will get your certificate and a link to the recording within 5 working days. So look out for that. You'll get an email. Immediately after this session, you'll be directed to a feedback survey to let us know what you thought. So please take a couple of minutes to complete that for us. Thirdly, a lot of the examples that Marek showed today were from our adult integrated skills program, which is called Voices. And if you're interested in learning more about Voices or any of our other programs, please click on one of the links that I'm just putting into the chat box now. So here you will see the Voices product page, an interactive sampler, and there's also the rep finder there. So if you want to talk to someone about one of our programs, please get in touch via that. I'm just going to give you a couple of links here again. So I'm actually doing another pronunciation webinar next week on the 15th of September. And it's going to be a kind of follow-up to what Marek's done today. So I'm going to be doing a model lesson using some of the materials, the content from Voices. So if you enjoyed what you saw today and you would like to see in a bit more detail, a bit more depth, like a whole, sort of actual activities that you can take part in, please join us on September the 15th for, I'm doing the webinar twice. This is Singapore time, 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. And yeah, be sure to join our online community for teachers of English on our social media channels. So you can find us on Facebook and on LinkedIn. And if you follow us, you will be able to find out all of our up-to-date information about events, practical classroom tips, real world content and new product information. And the last thing I'm going to drop into the chat box for you here. We have 2 webinar pages here. So if you'd like to see or sign up for our upcoming webinars, to get more excellent sessions like the one you saw today, please click on one of these websites or both and see what we've got coming up. Okay, so
thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Merrick. Thanks again. And we're right at the top of the hour. Yeah, so yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for everyone for joining us.
All right.
Have a
Take
lovely
care.
evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be. And
Bye-bye.
we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you, Merrick.